Since the theme of the symposium is the future of bread, and as we were thinking about who would be appropriate presenters to address that, I've just only recently, being on the East Coast here, not having been out in California for over a year, only recently discovered the existence of the Tartine Manufactory, which is the next iteration of the work of Chäd Robertson and his wife Elizabeth to the scene. And of course, I'm a huge fan of Tartine Bakery and Tartine Bar Tartine, the restaurant. So huge fan. But really, when I heard about what they're doing with the manufactory, I felt this, for me, represents, in a sense, the bakery and food service of the future. This is the future of bread, I think, in this iteration, in this form. So we invited Chäd to come out, and he has been working with documentary filmmaker J.D. Maklei to not only open Tartine in San Francisco manufacturing, but now they're working on one in LA. He'll talk all about that in a bit. And JD has been documenting all of that on film. So I'm going to have both of you come on out. And JD, why don't you sort of start us off with the video that you've been working on? I'm going to just show one more. Yeah,
Okay, so I had a different video to show, but my editors got a little carried away and made it 8 minutes long instead of 3. So I talked to Peter, and essentially everybody's going to get that emailed to them at some point, probably within the next week. So you'll have that to watch. Yeah. So it's essentially excerpts from the film at the manufactory during the creation, building of the manufactory, and a lot of the concepts that Chäd was going through at that time. What I'm going to show you instead is the old trailer of the film. And so to just set this up real quick, this has been a 5-year project now. It actually started in May, almost exactly 5 years ago, and really took off when I met Chäd and also Glenn Roberts, who is here. And you know, initially when we got started in this project as a film company, we thought we were just going to be making a film where we'd be covering stories, and it would be great. You know, everything was done. We're just going to go cover the stories. We're going to put it on film. We're going to make this beautiful film. And we quickly found out it wasn't that simple. You know, there was a lot of problems and not a lot of solutions. And we started asking questions that nobody had answers to. And we quickly found out nobody had actually asked those questions in maybe 100 years. So it's been a journey, and working with Chäd very directly for the last 3 years, the manufactory kind of became the R&D center for a lot of the things we were testing for the film, to get answers to some of these problems and to test R&D and to see what actually works, what actually doesn't. So I'll show you this trailer real quick. This is actually old. The old working title for the film was The Grain Divide, and there will be a brand new trailer coming out in the next 45 days, and the film will be out before the end of the year as a full feature film. And then we are also about to announce that there will be a documentary series, most likely through Netflix or Amazon, that will be several episodes that will essentially chronicle in sequence this entire journey through a 5-year process. That is the trailer. As I said, we'll be getting the long-form video to you shortly, and then the new trailer, the new name, the whole reboot of the film will be announced here in a couple months. So this was kind of like right before that, but we'll be moving on a new path there. So I think, Peter, do you want to take here? As I mentioned, you know, this project kind of took a major turn. We realized after about 2 years of doing research around the film, really the first 2 years of filming was to try to, first of all, figure out what was going on, and then try to get some answers to the questions. And so about 2 years into the project, I met Chäd, I met Glenn, and some various other people who were very like-minded, and we quickly formed an alliance to figure out exactly how we were going to move forward and work together to get some of these answers. And so I think this conversation, you know, over the last couple of years of being able to work with Chäd and do several projects together, the manufactory was kind of formed during that time, and Chad's been a big inspiration and their whole team in getting a lot of these answers moving forward. And so I'm essentially just going to guide a conversation here with Chäd that Chäd can kind of tell you about the process of the manufactory, and which I think was it's a long a long-term process that is still in motion. But let's start with Chad. You know, you mentioned a while back, you told me that, you know, when you started culinary school, you were actually studying as a savory chef until you discovered bread.
Yeah, so I went to culinary school out of high school, and I wanted to be a chef, so I figured if I learned how to cook, I could get a job anywhere in the world, and it's pretty much worked out that way. But I was in school for a couple of years and took a field trip to visit Berkshire Mountain Bakery. Richard Bourdon is a baker there, and I think I was about 21, right around there. And I walked into this big brick barn in Housatonic, Massachusetts, and I smelled sourdough bread. It was the first time in my life that I grew up in Texas, we had great barbecue, we didn't have great bread. So walking into this brick barn, it hit me, and I just decided, like, I need to learn how to make this. And I started apprenticing the next week with Richard Bourdon. And the manufactory, so yeah, I've been making bread for 20 years, and the manufactory is kind of our way of sort of getting back to being chefs in a broader sense, and sort of building a place where we can have a whole team of chefs figuring out how to use bread in every possible way for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
When you started the bakery, I think there was this maybe somewhat revolutionary model that you put in place, which was very chef-driven, right? I mean, kind of producing products all day long that were fresh, and freshness was kind of a key.
Yeah, so Liz Pruitt, my wife and partner, we met in culinary school, and we actually worked together as partners in school before we started dating, so we became friends first, and then we've been together for a long time. But when we opened the first Tartine in San Francisco in 2001 or 2002, we didn't want to work at night, and we approached the whole production from a chef perspective versus a baker's perspective, meaning you know, we didn't bake everything at night, fill up all the shelves, all the bakers go home, and you open the doors and you start selling. We basically timed everything so that the first croissants were coming out of the oven, the first scones, everything's coming out of the oven, you know, before we open the doors, and then we bake every hour, and we still do the same today. We bake basically just batch after batch every hour until, you know, till lunchtime, and then we switch over to sandwiches, and then with the manufactory, we sort of flip it around 4:35. We're still figuring this stuff out, and then we have a full-service dinner restaurant. So, yeah, manufactory is it's a process that's been a few years for us, and I think it's going to be a few more years before we really figure it out, and it may just be ongoing. But the biggest idea with the manufactory was that the idea was to build an environment and invite lots of chefs and build a team there so that we can just continue to evolve and try to bring the best food that we can possibly bring to people all day long.
You mentioned you opened the bakery, and then about 5 years later you felt like you'd outgrown it. And now you've been in the manufactory for a few months, and you feel like you've already outgrown that, and so there's already kind of rumblings about Los Angeles. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, when we opened, and we were probably a year behind the manufactory. After the first, we planned to open for breakfast and lunch, and obviously making bread, our bakery, and ice cream. And we were going to hold off dinner for the first 6 weeks, just so we could try to get breakfast and lunch working the way we want. We found out after 3 days that we didn't have enough space for the food to do dinner. So then we started looking for a commissary. We found a place across the street. Then we opened for dinner 2 months in, and yeah, we've already outgrown it. LA, we're building right now a pretty large space in a former industrial building, and yeah, it's a big project. The first time I saw it, it's where the old American Apparel manufacturing building was. It's still, the Alameda Farmers Market's still there, which is a huge, long-running farmers market that goes from like midnight till 8 in the morning. It's massive. But basically, when I was first shown the project in LA, it was so big, I was like, wanted to run away from it, and then I thought, you know, actually, if I can invite some chef friends like Chris Bianco and some other people that we're working with, we could tackle this thing and do something really special together. So for me, LA and kind of everything we're doing going forward, I'm looking at as an opportunity to collaborate with other chefs and bakers and people that I really admire to help us do something better.
I think we kind of found in common, I mean, one of the issues we ran into after 2 years of the film was looking at what were presented as the solutions and figuring out that pretty quickly there was maybe a little bit of elitist mentality or lack of capability of reaching the masses. And that maybe for over the last 20, 30 years or since Chez Panisse opened, you know, in the 70s, that there hasn't really been this capability to scale craft to a certain level where it's reaching beyond that 2%. And so we talked a lot about what it would look like to actually scale craft. Is that possible? You know, without compromise, to actually not just maintain the quality of the product, but actually make it better. And that quickly led to understanding the end-to-end process, that in order to do that, it starts with the seed, farm, the mill, into the bakery, and all the way into how it's consumed in diets. So I think that was really the kind of the foundation for what the manufacturer is based, and the LA is really going to bring that to life because you have all that space. And
yeah, you know, for the longest time I was like the lone baker in the little cottage in the country with the wood-fired oven, and I love all that, and I would do it all the same way again. But in 1998, these Australian brothers came to visit me, and they had decided they were going to start a bakery in Sydney with their dad. And you know, I gave them some sourdough starter, and they worked with me for a couple of weeks, and then went back. And two of the guys from Sonoma Bakery are here today, but they kept inviting me every year. You know, hey, come out and see what we're doing. And I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, first time I finally went. And I got there and I saw these guys making, you know, 10,000 loaves a day, like I was doing in 1998 in my wood-fired oven. And it was a real eye-opener to see that with the right ingredients and the right planning and the right setup, and some of you guys that have big bakeries obviously knew this a long time ago, but you can actually scale with quality. You just have to have serious commitment to certain things. So I've been baking for 25 years. For me, and we've written books and all that, the idea, the strongest motivation for me now is to take, you know, that position of being in this for a while and trying to scale in a way that you know, trying to raise the bar with scaling craft. And the more people say it can't be done, the more obviously we want to try it. But that's why I'm trying to collaborate with lots of people that know more than I do about this stuff to do it right.
I think, you know, our friend Chris Bianco always says, the only one not playing God is God. And I think there's a lot of judgment, you know, that we've learned over the years. What is good, what is bad? You know, it's kind of a black and white scenario versus that great space in between. And it seems like, you know, manufacturers kind of in that space also for the film, that we've been able to R&D that and kind of check out, you know, those, what is a definition? What is, you know, what is bread? What is pizza? What makes good? I think it's kind of come a foundation of that entire process. And so what I found interesting about Tartine as well in manufacturing is the inclusion of coffee. And all of that stuff I just mentioned kind of applies to what we've seen, whether you call it the third wave of coffee and that whole process of how coffee has really changed over the years. And you've talked a lot about the similarities of coffee and grain and your journey to you know, going back to when you were serving the best coffee of the day at the bakery to now having your own coffee company and how that integrates.
I mean, coffee is like grain in so many ways, and even coffee is like bread in that, you know, coffee, in my lifetime, coffee's gone from something that is practically free or given away, like bread in restaurants, to something that's, you know, sourced at a very high level and, you know, freshly ground, freshly brewed. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of the whole idea of, yeah, in the beginning of Tartine, we used Mr. Espresso, which is still there in Oakland, wood-fired coffee roaster. At the time, it was what Chez Panisse was using, so that was like the coffee of the day. And then, you know, 10 years went by, and I saw people bringing third-wave coffee cups into our bakery, and they wanted our pastries, but they didn't want our coffee anymore. And so I sort of realized like something's changing here. And then we went on this journey of going through, you know, a few really good third wave roaster friends. Then we almost merged with a coffee company, which was an interesting exercise. Then I was trying to figure out after we didn't do that what I want to do with coffee. I had a very real interest in, you know, how to move forward with coffee in a meaningful way. And I met our current coffee partner and a good friend, Chris Jordan, who was at Starbucks in the very early days when they had like 50 stores, and was there for a long time. And he ended up sort of as the very, very serious sourcing guy, lived in Africa for 6 years, worked on building coffee infrastructure with farmers there. And when I met him, he was CEO of Verve Coffee, which is this great roaster in Santa Cruz. And I was like, what do you think I should do? Whose coffee do you think I should use? And he said, why don't you just start your own? Like, I can help you get beans. So that was a year ago, and now we're building a roaster in LA that's going to be up and running before the end of the year. And I love it. It's great. Coffee is a little bit easier to deal with than wheat, actually.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, the definitions, when we started the film project was kind of when the whole gluten thing was picking up. You know, we've talked about that extensively, and we won't go into that. But the idea that people don't eat gluten, they don't actually normally eat grains. They eat pizza, pasta, beer, bread, and whiskey. And so I kind of call them the pillars of grain, and that's essentially what people eat. And the definitions of those foods have been so bastardized over time. So, you know, we did this exercise in the film where we went and asked people, what is pizza? And they would give a description, and generally it's Pizza Hut or Domino's, and it's the meat lovers, and it's, you know, all these wonderful toppings. And then we compare that to a Pizzeria Bianco marinara with organic tomato sauce and a nice fresh basil leaf on top with a thin 24-hour fermented crust. And so the definitions are completely different. And so we've talked a lot over the years with beer, obviously the connection that has to bread, pizza, which is just bread with stuff on top. Then you have bread, and you have whiskey. I mean, I think a lot of people probably aren't aware of the big plans of the manufacturer in LA and how a lot of those things are ultimately going to be integrated over the next year in that whole process that kind of creates that whole full circle of all those pillars. Yeah,
I'm super excited to be working with Chris Bianco in LA and some other chef partners that we're working with. But just like JD said, we're the manufacturer serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner with a whole team of people I really admire to basically, explore, you know, we make an egg sandwich, how can we make a better bun? You know, we're using different whole grain porridges, inclusions in our bun. I mean, it looks like a regular burger bun or egg sandwich bun, but there's actually a lot more going on. Then at lunchtime, we make, you know, kind of a focaccia, but again, it's like we're using different kind of inclusions to get more whole grain, more fresh milled, diverse grains, even grains without gluten, into that bread product. Same thing at dinner, we're milling fresh for our pasta, we're fermenting our pasta, and just exploring all these things. And that's kind of the idea with the manufacturer, is to make, obviously it has to be a business, so we're still figuring that part out too, but it's kind of a forum for a team of chefs, and including chefs that don't necessarily work for us, but like next week we have a good friend from New York City who's coming in, and he's basically we're doing like a takeover of the manufactory. So he's designing the sandwiches, he's designing lunch and desserts and our ice cream, and our whole team's just going to basically execute what he wants to do. So that's a big part of the program too, is just inviting people that inspire us from around the world to come in and play around in our world and try to push everything forward.
Talk, you know, as far as the foundation in the community, there's been a lot of testing with whether it's milling or, you know, going out and meeting with farmers, looking at grains. I mean, you've been interested in different varieties of grains for a very long time, you know, famously the porridge bread, you know, finding ways to put these grains into breads. But now you're actually involved in the process of working with the breeders, the farmers, finding better ways to mill, how to get your flour fresher, and what that's adding to a product that maybe people have been eating for, you know, 10 years at Tartine. how that's going to change. You mentioned the new country loaf and how you're working on that. What that's going to look like with the new manufacturing model.
Yeah, I'm really excited to try some new flours that are actually, some of the first ones are coming in next week, and I'm sort of saying we're going to have Tartine Country 2.0 starting next week, and you know that makes a lot of people nervous. People that work for me too, they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, the person that likes our normal bread for the last 20 years, they're gonna like this. It's not a radical departure. It's just we're always just trying to make what we do better. Like I said, I visited that on that field trip, Richard Bourdon. It changed my life. I decided I wanted to make bread, and Richard tells the story of when he was a young man studying the French horn at the Royal Conservatory in Copenhagen, Denmark. He went to a bakery in the Netherlands, Manna it was called, back in the 70s, and had his first natural leavened bread and dropped the French horn and decided to become a baker. So it's just like a full circle thing. But after I worked for Richard, I wanted to go learn from his mentor because I had heard about this guy, Patrick Laporte, in Savoie, that was baking in a wood-fired oven with natural leaven, fresh milled, you know, organic, lots of whole grain. And this was in like 95. And I went to visit this guy. He gave us a place to live. And in 95, in the country in France, he was using einkorn or petit épaule, which was a small spelt, the one that they used in France. And he was using kamut. He was using all these grains. And that was the first time I saw this stuff. And oddly enough, like now, I mean, my favorite grain that JD helped me source is an einkorn that's being grown in North Dakota. And it's like, yeah, full circle.
You know, talking about scaling, so it's going back, you know, scaling without compromise. We've talked a lot about technology. You've been testing, you know, figuring out the milling thing. Obviously, you know, the freshness of the flour is something you've always liked, but also what makes sense, you know, in a lot of times people rush to, hey, this is the best way to do it, but you've got this new tabletop mill you've been testing, but you're also partnering with millers to get fresher flour and higher quality, and acknowledging that community that it requires to do things in a proper way, but also in a realistic way.
Yeah, I mean, I started, the guys that taught me, they were all milling. In the case of like Dave Miller, who was the second baker I worked for, he was milling everything fresh, and you know, it's amazing. And in the case of Richard, he was milling some of his stuff. He was milling his whole rye, you know, every week. And when I met you, I was really trying to figure out like what kind of milling I wanted to do. I've definitely decided I want to get back to using really fresh milled stuff after eating like lots of grains from Glen. You know, it's just you can't. There's no other way to get that flavor besides milling fresh. But I felt like I wanted to figure out, you know, what's the best way for me to do this. So, of course, I bought a giant mill. It's a 1.5 meter stone mill that I thought 3 years ago, I think I bought it. I thought that was going to be the thing to do. It's still in the crate. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, but then I visited guys like Dave Bauer at Farm and Sparrow that are making incredible stuff, milling everything fresh, but he's basically not baking anymore. He's milling full time. So I started to see that for me to mill all my own grain myself, I would have to have a full-time miller, and then the whole thing just didn't really make much sense. Why wouldn't I just work very, very closely with millers that are nearby and try to input the best knowledge ongoing into that system and really optimize it so that I can get what I want and everyone else can get that same quality too.
You've also implemented a little bit of fresh milling for the pastas, so identifying some of those things that you can do on a small scale that makes sense with a tabletop space that isn't taking a bunch of footprint, but you're still getting some of that flavor pop and then integrating that as kind of a hybrid model, right? Yeah,
well, that's the other side of it of, you know, being a baker and a chef. That's the other side of, you know, making fresh pasta daily for the restaurant. It's easy enough for us to mill, you know, 5 kilos of grain and then go straight into the extruder and make some really great pasta with a little bit of natural leaven in it, so that, with extruded pasta, it's 50% hydration, so it's super dry. So you can actually ferment that, and it doesn't really change the shape, and you're getting something that's more digestible, a little more flavor. But yeah, it's nice to be able to play with as a baker and as a chef, because like JD said, it's pizza, pasta, pastry, beer. It's like all these things. Now we're also getting into brewing with some other brewers, because we're really just trying to figure out like all these different ways to utilize grain and push it forward.
I think you told me a while back that the books that you've written over the years have always been kind of an exercise for innovation within your team. And it seems like that same element is kind of transferring into the manufactory, where you've got the coffee now, you're working on the beer, the ice cream is another thing, but it all kind of follows the same process of trying to control more end-to-end, innovate a little bit, push the limits, but always ensuring that no compromise in the end product.
Yeah, I mean that's always a challenge when you're around for a long time doing the same thing. Is either I get lazy or complacent, or your team gets bored. And so the way I've chosen to sort of deal with that is just to keep trying to innovate, keep trying to make things better, obviously, and ultimately putting all this stuff in books. So once you put everything you've learned into a book and put it out there, you're kind of forced to move on to the next thing, because it's all out there. So that's an ongoing process. We're doing a manufacturing book now. We certainly haven't figured everything out, but what we have figured out, we're going to put that into a book and just keep going. A lot like the modernist cuisine guys. I mean, that's what I respect so much about them, is they just keep asking. They keep asking themselves questions, and they never really stop. Never stop learning.
I think that's the key thing we've learned, working together, and whether it's the film or manufacturing, a lot of the projects we've worked on to R&D is, it really never ends. Ultimately, a lot of times people want an answer. They want black or white. What's good, stone mill or roller mill? Well, maybe both. How do you use them? You can ruin flour on a stone mill. You can ruin flour on a roller mill. There's a lot less about the tools, but more how you use them. And ultimately, I think, as we looked at what the solutions might be, and we've talked about this a lot, that the immediate reaction a lot of times is to want to go back in time. I think, what is the solution to industrialization of the Green Revolution? Well, let's go back and do everything they were doing before that. Well, ultimately, what we found out as we kind of went down that path initially, and I think that's kind of when you bought your mill, was, hey, let's just go do all this stuff. What we really wanted was the targets, the goals of what food was back then, the culture, the search for flavor and nutrition, all of that, but also the culture of enjoying the food together. And I think we've come to a place to try to find a new direction of how that all comes together, realizing that especially in grain, it requires community. It requires a farmer, it requires a seedsman, it requires a miller, it requires all these different pieces. And I think that's the beautiful thing about manufacturing over the last several months, is for the first time we've been able to kind of put all of these ideas in an environment where they can be tested. And I think you have a lot of plans to continue pushing the limits with that and testing technology. I mean, you've got new mixers, you've got the new oven and all that stuff as well.
Yeah, I think when I first met you, I was asking myself a lot of questions about milling, because when I first started apprenticing, learn how to make bread, it was stone mills, and I still love them. But I had this idea in my head that the roller mill was just a machine that could be used for good or evil, and people had sort of chosen to use it for evil. And JD was like, well, at the bread lab they have every kind of mill. They have stone mill, they have hammer mill, they have roller mill, everything. So that's the first trip I went there, was to basically figure that out. And another thing JD always says is, everyone, including me, is always looking for the silver bullet, answer to everything, and of course, never is, almost never. The milling question was way more complicated than just what kind of mill. It ends up being a combination of a lot of different things. But again, whatever we think we've learned now, and we've learned some great things, I'm sure in the next 5 years, we're going to learn a lot of new stuff.
I think that was the key too, is, initially it seemed really easy, and that was the film. And even when we were talking, like, there was the answers out there. Oh, you just do this now and everything's better. But then when we started doing that and trying to scale that to a certain level, you realize really quickly, maybe that's not the answer. And so, I think the important part is to start at a good position of understanding where, like Chris Bianco always says, the unintentional sins of our fathers. You know, what did they think they were doing? What did they end up doing? How can we recognize how things changed for the worse and then fix that problem? And I think that's really what manufacturing is all about, and that's essentially what this whole journey has been about, of trying to figure out what that means.
I'm going to jump in here at this point and encourage you to start thinking about questions. We're going to leave a little bit of more time today for Q&A for both of these gentlemen, because you know, what we're really talking about, I think, is visionary work, and I think the whole theme of the symposium has been about visionary thinking and trying to think outside the frames and the boxes that we've been customarily used to thinking in. And so I'll get the ball rolling with just a question, and then we'll see if any of you want to start to pose some questions. I'll bring the mic to you as we did yesterday, okay? So as you've been describing the journey, and even the idea that you're on a journey, which implies that it's still a lot of learning going on, a lot of unfolding and self-discovery going on. And your journey now, it seems also, Chad, has been to open up to include a lot of collaborators and work with other people, kindred spirits, so to speak. Can you speak a little bit about what you're looking for? What is that characteristic and quality that defines the kindred spirits and the fire that's burning within them that you're sparking with, that leads you to want to collaborate with them?
It's probably difficult to pin down, but I can sort of say how it works in my head. You know, most, like, bakeries are kind of like, you know, say Guerrero, our original bakery. It's a corner bakery. It's kind of the hub of the neighborhood, one of the hubs of the neighborhood. And you know, people come to a bakery and they want the same thing every day. And I understand that. And obviously, as bakers, we're always trying to be super consistent and produce everything, you know, at a very high level all the time. It was maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I don't know, there was a wave of really creative stuff happening in the chef community, not so much the baking community, but and I've always been friends. I've remained friends with tons of chefs all over, and for our book number 3, that was kind of me throwing a ton of ideas at the wall and seeing what stuck. I planned a trip to Copenhagen to explore grains. Basically, the first bread book that I did was kind of everything I had. There was no more story to tell, and I really enjoyed making the book with my team, and it was a learning experience for me as much as everyone else. And so I wanted to do another one, but I didn't really have any story. So the idea was just go on an adventure and meet people and try to learn stuff. So I went to Copenhagen, and Glenn introduced me to this guy, Anders Borgen, who's a wheat breeder. That was the moment when I went there was sort of the time, I don't know, his life's work. He was starting to bring all these Nordic wheats back into production, and they were starting to use them. So it was a really fortuitous time that I ended up there, and all these guys just blew my mind. And I met Klaus Meyer, and then everything that was happening at Noma and guys at Relay, and I sort of came back with this super inspiration to explore and bring back more grains, and you know, Dan Barber mentioned it in the trailer. It was this thing where, you know, it's happened in Mark Vetri too. It's happened with produce and with meat and with all these other ingredients, but when I was first coming into baking, it was like, you know, white flour and wheat flour. Why wouldn't we have, you know, I mean, there's thousands of different varieties of grain. Why wouldn't we be using this whole range of stuff and exploring all the flavors that we could bring? So that was kind of the start of that journey, and then it really sort of put together the disciplines of being a baker and being a chef, and really approaching bread and what we do, you know, not as something that, you know, we sort of slap together and put it on the table and it's filler and it's free, as something, you know, the manufactory is as much a forum to take bread in every possible form and grain in every form and present it to the public in different ways, and learn, like, you know, how we can make it more interesting, more, you know, more different kinds of food.
So I'm going to start to open the floor to some questions from you all. If there's anybody that has, of course, I've got tons of questions, but I want to let you get yours in. So we're going to get the ball rolling over here.
As you guys talk about scaling craft, and it's like super cool and interesting to me, I can't help but not think about what William was talking about in the first thing about the deeper structures in bread. And I was wondering if you've thought at all about the fact that even if you create a larger manufactory, it's still sort of like we're still making an elite product. And I was wondering if you'd done any thinking about, like, are there other even economic models to explore, or, like co-ops or profit sharing or stuff like that? Or are you still just sort of thinking of yourself as like fine dining chef, artist? I mean, obviously you are thinking about yourself in that regard, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, great question. And yes, we've talked about this a lot, and it's a huge part of what we're doing. One of the really common reactions I get when you say, "Are you scaling?" Is you can't do it, and then I look around and the people that have scaled, once you start out as this artisanal thing and everyone loves, the little baker in the countryside, and then when you scale, you don't have that anymore. And a very easy common sense solution to that is like you do both, and that's what we're going to do. So, and I have bakers that work for me that want to scale, and I have some that don't want to scale at all. They came to work for Tartine because of the idea of this small, super artisanal baker. So we're going to do both. And visiting the Sonoma guys, visiting bakers in Germany, doing really massive production at a very, very high level. And for the consumer, super inexpensive. Really opened my eyes as well. I mean, if you have a bread eating culture like Germany, where bread is like water. I mean, you have it with every meal. You have little buns, and they want it to be very cheap, and they want it to be very high quality. So they figured it out. And for me, that's the challenge that we're going to work on here, is to have one line, and the Sonoma guys have done it as well. I mean, making a line of super artisanal stuff, and then making a line that goes into supermarkets, and it's affordable and it's high quality. Right now, in general, you either have this expensive elitist bread, or you're relegated to eating just total crap, and that's not the way it should be. So, yeah, absolutely, we're really going to try. I mean, we're going to do it. We're focusing on a line of super affordable stuff that's going to be, my thing has got to be exactly the same ingredients, exactly the same fermentation as the other process. It just has to be automated somewhere, so you're taking, you're moving some of that over to, or you can cut the price that way, but you're not cutting it by using lesser ingredients.
And we have a question over here. Thanks.
So sorry. This isn't as much of a philosophical question, but you mentioned that you're going to be changing the flour for your country loaf, and I wanted to know what you're achieving with new flour. How is the flour changing?
I'm not exactly sure where we're going to end up, but the idea is to use fresher stuff, and to utilize some of these different varieties of grain that are being grown now. There's always been some of these different varieties in small quantities, but now we're starting to get much larger quantities of them, so we're able to make blends, say base white blends that have much more flavorful varieties of wheat in them than we've been using.
For someone who experienced your country loaf a few years ago when it was sort of first hitting, and I thought it was one of those aha breads, and I even wrote about it in one of my books. It was so good that you start to ask yourself, how can it get any better than this? So what can you do? What kind of changes in the flour are you looking for that are going to make that bread even better? For those of you who've never had that bread, it's it's an extraordinary simple loaf of bread that just seems to capture all the magic of what bread can be. And so I get, when I hear about we're going to even make it better, I go, how do you do that?
Very, very kind words. Thank you. It's kind of like William was saying yesterday. It's a little bit playing with the cuffs. So I really mean it when I say anyone that likes the country loaf now is going to like it, but the people that really, I think, that are really obsessing over it are going to notice just more flavor. I mean, but that said, I mean, as we all know, this anyone who's baking bread, the country loaf is not always, it goes up and down. And, one day a week, maybe it's where I want it to be. The rest of the time it's good, but it's not there. So I'm just always trying to get more in that zone, Well,
I remember interviewing Eric Wolfinger, who was baking with you at the time, and he told me that only a few of the bakers in the shop really were able to handle that dough. It took special touch and train. So which leads to the question in terms of scaling is how are you going to train the next generation of bakers who are out there when you're not there making the loaf or watching over them to be able to hit those standards? Have you given some thought to that regime?
Lots of thought. I mean, when I first learned to work with wet dough, as Richard Bourdon was making really wet doughs, and that was pretty unusual at the time in the early 90s. Now it was a big issue then. There were people that really had a hard time learning how to work with that dough. Now it's kind of a lot of people know how to work with it. So the bigger issue now is if you're working with natural leaven, which we are, as any of you know that are also, is just, making a sourdough and keeping it in a jar is one thing. Ours, gets fed multiple times per day, and there's a small window where it's really working the way we want it to. And then once you mix your dough, you've got 24 or 36 or whatever hours until you really know what's going to happen. And that's the bigger question, is how to maintain different stages of fermentation. That's what we're kind of working on now. In the manufactory, in the original bakery, our temperature control was opening the windows and doors, and I did that for many, many years. Then with the manufactory, we built climate-controlled rooms, which I thought was going to be, solve all my problems, and actually created more problems. We could control everything that we used to take for granted, and then it was just a big disaster because we had too much power, over what was happening. We've learned a lot in 8 months, and so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of that's an ongoing process.
I said, Wolfgang, you had a question. If anyone on this side has a question, I'll bring the mic ahead.
I want to say something about the difference between German bakers and bakers in America. I always thought our bakers were very good. I do not think it now. Because I showed in my speech pictures when I started to bake bread, 100% dry bread and so on, in 77 and 78. After some years, the organic bakers in Germany were very good. Then they began to scale up. They grew, were bigger and bigger, and the quality went down. I'm sure you will do it better. So some years ago, I was disappointed every year, more and more. And some years ago, I started again to bake the bread myself, because I was so disappointed about the quality the German bakers deliver. But last January, Mike Sokowski visited us, together with Magnus from New York, and what they did was amazing. I could not believe that an American baker could make breads like they did. So then more and more bakers came to us, including Pablo, who worked in LA for 1 year, and I learned your bakers, your artisan bakers, are on a very high quality and better than most bakers in Germany I know. That's what I want to say. So I hope that scaling up, as you will do it, you will do it on a high quality like you did as a corner baker. I hope so. And I hope the German bakers will learn from American bakers and do a restart.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's great news. Well, of course, the American bakers, as many of you know, those who have been charting this this American baking journey, has been an incredible learning experience, and I think we've seen, as our competition teams have proven, that the quality of bakers, we've learned from the European bakers, I think, everything we could learn from them and level.
How they have to learn from you.
And now it's going the other way, which is fabulous. It's great news for us, but also great news because the world is getting smaller, and I think everyone's learning. I mean, Chad's going over to Copenhagen to learn from, and bringing that all back, and this has been part of the process, and you're all part of that. Those of you who are baking in here or milling in here are part of that same process. I think we have time for one more question.
Let me say one thing real quick,
ahead, JD,
just regarding that. I think, talking about scaling, in the film and in everything Chad and I have done together, initially we started with this concept of revolution, like let's start a bread revolution, which, and then ultimately we kind of ended up with evolution, like this is an evolution. We're learning, we're trying to figure it out. And everybody would say, we started with the term rebuild the foundation of food. Let's rebuild the culture around bread. And now we're saying, well, maybe we can build the ideal grain culture and food culture for the first time, because we have technology now. We have machines that can make a really interesting equipment with CNC machines. We have nutritional information, all these things. And so I think when we talk about scaling, and Chad talks about scaling within the manufacturing, we actually generally say, well, what if we can scale and actually make the product better? What if scaling is possible, but actually making a more improved product with all of this information, technology, but renewing those targets of old. So, and then Chad always says, when you get to that point and you realize it's starting to go downhill, that's where you stop. Pushing it to the point before compromise and then stopping and maybe taking a few steps back.
It's great that you're, to even ask the question, finding the right questions to ask seems to be the beginning of that process. Okay, one last question. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering if you've considered at all, instead of trying to scale and make it less expensive, working on the root causes that need people to buy cheap food. Because I wonder if we need to change the paradigm, and if you've considered that, whether real food costs real money, and that maybe people in America need to be able to make more money so they can afford to eat real food. So have you considered that perspective?
I have considered it. I consider it every day. And if you spend time in Scandinavia, you see a whole different kind of system.
I lived in Denmark for a year, yeah.
Yeah, so, but yeah, I mean, people as a society make choices on how things go. So I'm kind of working within what we have. And when I say cheaper, I don't mean a loaf of bread's going to cost 50 cents. It might cost $4 instead of $8. So it's, again, yeah, I'm with you, but I'm kind of trying to work with what we've got.
Well, and on that point too, I think I agree 100%. I think part of what I'm trying to do with the film and why this has taken 5 years is trying to articulate value in real food. And if people can understand the story and what it takes to create and why it's a better food, what makes good is the question, and how do you explain that? And getting people to readjust their priorities, because one of the things I hear all the time is, well, nobody has time to cook anymore in our modern world. Well, we have more time than we've ever had in history because of technology and communication devices and email and all these things. We just spend it differently. And so part of my mission is to really articulate these stories and the value in this kind of food, and hopefully reinstill some culture so that people want to take that time to maybe mill their own flour, make their own bread, and eat better food. And then therefore, when that changes, when the priority changes, they will readjust how much money they're spending on their food, because they now understand the value in it.
And we're hoping through the WUVA app that you all have, that we'll be able to announce soon when the series will begin. Hopefully, and most likely maybe on Netflix. Keep an eye out for that. But we'll get the word out, right?
Yeah. So the feature film will be out within the next 6 months, and it's become a much more massive film and project with some incredible partners. And so there will be a very big tour. I'm not going to say too much about it because we're close to announcing it, and there will be a lot of information there with a new trailer and a lot of content leading up to that. And then we will be releasing. One thing I realized is the importance of the journey of getting to where we started to where we are. We were ultimately trying to come up with answers, not questions. And that was my goal from the very beginning. Let's not put something out until we have answers to the questions, instead of creating more questions, or what a lot of films do, hysteria and anger. So let's find the answers. But then ultimately, when we got close to releasing the film again, I said, hey, the lesson in the journey has been really critical. So we're going to release everything that we've filmed along the 5 years in series. So anybody that's ever been filmed will be in one of these series in bits, and it'll be, kind of probably anywhere from 20 to 30 episodes in this series on Netflix.
So keep an eye out for that. And how about a round of thanks for this provocative conversation. Thank you very much, guys.